I want to talk about something that is an issue that may or may not, but most likely may affect most of you here. Talking about working abroad or deciding to sort of spend some of your life being a professional abroad. What kind of choices you make and how would this impact the rest of your life? It sounds like an ambitious speech. Basically, we live today, and it may sound like a cliche, but actually we do live in a very interconnected world. If 100, 200 years ago to get a letter from Paris to St. Petersburg took 6 months, and getting a job abroad used to be a very difficult thing, now we have Skype, we have LinkedIn, we actually can research our target job, we can decide to move there, and we can decide to actually stay in our countries until we actually get the perfect job. Some of us actually go there, out there and get it, but the whole point is, I want to talk about sort of generally the global professionals, the global talent, as it moves from a place to another, following the labor market needs in different parts around the world. Now, I would start actually by talking about first the ones who will hunt and target a job from their home country and then actually go there, where you will estimate the vectors, the two vectors you need, your expertise and the need for your expertise and where it is, and of course the salary. So I'm going to talk about the people who go out there and find their market, right? I mean, you're sitting here, you're thinking, well, where do I want to go? What do I want to do? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Where could I actually find some kind of work? And I'll sort of take a little detour through history because it's one of my fetishes to actually illustrate the phenomenon of global sort of labor needs and how this was addressed throughout history, right? So let's go back to 1914, Europe, right? It starts out very nice, a beautiful year, but then, the unthinkable happened. Sarajevo, assassination. World War I breaks out and countries sort of declare war on each other. Russia finds itself dragged into this sort of global conflict, and within 6 weeks, it actually mobilizes 1.5 million men. It puts them under arms, it hastily puts them into 6 armies and throws them in battle against the combined might of Prussia and Austria. So this is not necessarily a history lesson, but I do want to show you basically the name of the generals that were actually leading these Russian armies, right? Now, gosh, it looks almost like I put the Germans there too, but in fact, these are the Russian generals. They were 6 armies had 3 German generals, and then von Salza was actually changed with Evert later on in the conflict. So out of 7 generals, 4 were Germans. Now some of them were Baltic Germans, basically born in what is now Estonia and so on. But others, and especially when you actually look at the Russian army top echelons, were full German officers that actually had come to Russia to work, right? To sort of share some of their knowledge and certainly lead armies. Now why would they do that? And in fact, the real question, the real answer here is that they were part of a global trend of professionals that would actually see a niche for their services and go there and take it, okay? Now, so far as the Russian army is concerned, I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that the Germans are warriors, what they do best, but certainly there was a certain sort of expertise in military tactics that was sometimes superior to what at that time was being taught. Which it kind of reminds me, I mean, back in 90s, I lived in England, and one time I remember reading in a newspaper which was reprinting some of its editorials from years before. So I read an editorial that was came out in 1966, the day before the World Cup final, right, between England and West Germany, the only World Cup that England has won thus far. And the editorial was very funny because it actually does talk, it's sort of a technical analysis of the two teams. They say, well, our sort of center left is better than theirs, full back and so on, and why, and they actually go through this whole thing. But the last paragraph kind of caught my attention, where they actually mentioned that, well, and notwithstanding all this great analysis about the match tomorrow, if through some strange twist of fate, the Germans should beat us tomorrow at our national game, let us not forget that twice this century we beat them at their national game. Kind of hinting, of course, that the Germans know only one game. This is obviously not true, but the one thing that did happen, like I said, is at that time, Russia had been, for almost 200 years then, had been actively courting foreign professionals to come. And it is by no means the only country that has sort of decided to modernize by using this sort of international labor force. If you actually look at some of the countries, you know, the place to be, if you will, it's, you know, Russia was, from the days of Peter the Great, one of them, but Japan made the link between 1868 and 1912. It has moved from a rural peasant society to one of the most powerful empires ever, using almost exclusively foreign sort of advisors, mainly French and some German, to modernize the entire society. They actually even changed the nobility ranks, okay? You are no longer a daimyo, you are now a baron. So the Japanese just literally changed the entire society and brought them to the modern world. USA, of course, after the Civil War and right before the Great Depression, was also the place to be, had breakneck speed of development. Some of the Eastern European countries, after their independence until the 1930s, had invested heavily in their, basically just about everything, from education to infrastructure. You know, some of you may know the Ungen Bridge, you know, the railroad bridge was built by, of course, Gustav Eiffel, you know, the Eiffel Tower guy. He actually was here doing stuff. He actually also built, I believe, the Traian Hotel in Iași. So if you actually go to the main center of Iași, you will see one of the hotels built by Eiffel, part of this global thingy. Of course, in the 60s, 50s to the 70s, you had the post-colonial states, and now these days, of course, we have the Gulf states, we have Azerbaijan, we have what they call the N11, which is sort of, the term is actually Next 11, an idea that's being cooked up to see which are the next explosive growth countries. And basically this is what happens when countries decide to invest in the infrastructure, all of them, educational, military, industrial, and so on, and attracts global sort of mobile global labor. However, I mean, we have to also keep in mind that it comes a point when countries do become very successful, when they actually manage to educate enough of their citizens to the point where there's no need anymore for expats and so on. And sometimes you got to see the writing on the wall. I mean, right now, for instance, Poland and Hungary and so on, you have plenty of very well-educated locals who manage to actually do the same kind of jobs and much better sometimes. If you actually look at these generals, you will also notice a pretty sort of sad observation is that most of them were really bad generals. It wasn't their fault. They had a disastrous conduct of the war, but they were not probably the best generals. And the only guy who was one of the top generals, probably in the war, is the last guy, Brusilov. And Brusilov was a local boy. He actually went to school in St. Petersburg. So you kind of know when it comes to the point where the time of the sort of foreign experts and foreign expats actually has passed, and the country turns more and more to its own resources. And that's sort of the golden mean for any country. But what happens though if you actually immigrate to a country, right? I mean, you're fleeing some dictatorship or something, or you marry somebody that lives in another country and you have to go and live in that country with them. Suddenly you don't choose your market anymore. You have no choice. You are there. You have to do something. So I want to say that you should try to make your market if you're there. And basically find a niche that makes you special and actually work that. I'll tell you a little bit of my own personal history. My parents immigrated from Romania back in the 1980s. And of course, they didn't have much of a choice. They had gone to Italy to visit a relative. And the real choice was, do we go back where my sister and I we stayed behind at that time, or do we try to sort of make something else for ourselves and for our children especially? So their choice was split second. You either stay or you leave. And they made sort of a fairly courageous choice to go ahead, and they end up in the US, and I ended up in the US along with them and so on. And I was a kid, I didn't really understand a lot of things, but for somebody they were both engineers, and for somebody who actually is a professional in your own country, to be sort of plopped in a new country where you don't speak the language and you don't really get a lot of the credit for your education and the things you've done in the past, it is a very tough thing. You really have to sort of think on your feet. I mean, one of the ways they used to deal with this, because it was a bit depressive, I mean, they started from the very bottom, and the US is one of the most amazing countries in the world, especially for immigrants, but it's a country where the state really expects you to sort of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, find your own way. It does not really support you in the way most European social states tend to do. So you are thrown in sort of the deep end. So the way they would oftentimes deal with this is they would, one of the ways, and it was funny for me, but it really was a bit sad, is they end up sort of going to this, like once a month there was this party that was organized by this Romanian guy who would like make his basement out really nice and would charge about $30. And once a month, all these other Romanian emigres would dress up beautifully and they would go there and they would talk to each other and they would call each other Mr. Doctor, Mrs. Lawyer, Mr. Engineer. And my parents would feel good about sort of feeling a little bit of that old credit. And it kind of reminded me a little bit how, I go back to Russia, how Russian aristocrats in the 20s after the Civil War would be in Paris and call each other Baron and Baroness, but then they'll go back to like working as, fairly menial jobs. So that, in the end, of course, everything turns okay. My parents end up doing very well, and luckily they actually invested in me, which I thought was a great idea. But, so what do you really do, right? What do you do about making your market? And I want to tell you about a story about a guy. Anybody who's lived in the US in the 1980s knows him. He was a bit of a minor celebrity, a guy named Yakov Smirnoff. Yakov was a guy from the former Soviet Union. He was born in Odessa, and he actually immigrated to the States back in the 70s. And he was sort of a, Soviet sort of immigrant, and like many of them in the New York region was trying to make ends meet. There was also a bizarre little thing, because when you actually came from a former communist state, especially as an immigrant to the US, you always felt this bizarre need to be more Catholic than the Pope, almost try to prove your anti-communism, lest you be sort of somehow suspected of harboring fantasies. So poor Yakov is trying to sort of blend in, and he's not, he has a very thick accent, and he actually has a different name. It wasn't Smirnoff, he had a different name coming in. And at one point he actually decides, he sees an opportunity. He says, I'm gonna make this my moneymaker. Because at that time, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was seen as sort of a big, sort of scary place. You see all these movies, Rambo, Rocky IV, the Russians are always these sort of machines bred to kill. So he decided he's gonna be the funny Russian. He's gonna be a stand-up comedian. So he started making a lot of jokes, show up at nightclubs and do stand-up comedy, wearing this big fur hat and a big star and dressed up sometimes in Russian stuff. And his jokes were fairly simple. They were very much a copy of the Radio Yerevan jokes, as you know. And it would be like, in Soviet Union you do this, in America you do that, haha. And it caught on, basically. One of his jokes was basically something like, well, in America, you are the life of the party, huh? But in Soviet Union, the party is your life. So he would say things, and then he would finish it with his trademark laugh and be like, America, what a country. And people loved him for that, and he actually made a big name for himself. I remember another joke, which I personally liked. It was about American Express, the credit card. He would say, in America, you have American Express, and the motto is, don't leave home without it, which used to be at that time the motto. In Russia, we also have Russian Express, and the motto is, don't leave home. So basically, he would sort of do this stuff. He became pretty famous. That's Yakov over there. He started writing books. There's his little thing. There's the Russian Express, and he says, don't leave home right there. So he wrote books. He actually had a TV show. He became pretty famous and well known. Of course, his world kind of came to an end when the Soviet Union collapsed. Suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. I mean, you don't laugh about the Russians. It's a country going through a horrible breakup. And, Yakov just wasn't making sense anymore. So his star kind of went down a little bit, but he is one of those guys. Here's another shot of Yakov doing his thing. He's one of those guys that was sort of basically found an opportunity in what many would sort of see as a weakness. Okay? Now, of course, not everybody can be Yakov or go into showbiz or another. Actually, you know, there's another European with a really messed up last name and with a thick accent who didn't really have any discernible skills, but managed to become, you know, a great sort of actor and a politician and marry into American royalty, right? You guys know who that is? Schwarzenegger, right? Yeah, he never changed his name. Everybody can say Schwarzenegger now. So basically, nobody can be Schwarzenegger or Yakov. Not everybody can do that, but the idea is always find a niche you're good at and go up as far as you can. We have seen people here. We have heard. I believe Oleg. I think it was the circus artist who did that amazingly. We're going to have other speakers who have done that. You know, one of my own personal heroes, Dr. Arafat, who's going to be here, is really someone you should listen to. He actually came from a different culture, kind of integrated very well, and became so good at what he did. Literally, he probably could run for president of Romania and get more votes than anybody else. So that's the kind of stuff you wanna focus on. And you know, as a parting thought, basically, I also want to tell you that I want to practice what I preach in this. And it's been always my dream to start to go to the Olympics. I mean, I used to play rugby in college. I'm a bit out of shape, but I figure, how do I actually go about that? And the real thing is, like I said about the Russian generals, is try to find, I thought, you know, and I'm still working on this, but find a sport nobody knows anything about, and find a country that nobody heard much about, and then just be that guy who does that sport in that country, okay? So I've been hard at work practicing curling. It's an awesome sport, so you know I might be too late for the Sochi Olympics, but Mr. Zhuravsky, if you're watching this, you are talking now to the next curling champion and representative of Moldova, okay? So I want to thank you all, guys, and hope to see you at the next one. Bye-bye.